Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, The Good, the Bad, and Philosophy. In this video, we're going to be looking at answering the question, is cultural appropriation immoral? From the perspective of deontology. So, to review, the first half of this series looked at the three top normative theories of ethics: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. In this half of the series, we are applying these theories to modern ethical questions to see what answers they will give. This is in part because these ethical questions seem like very problematic and difficult questions to answer, and people offer many of their own arguments, but frequently they don't rely back on the original arguments or basic framework that we should be using if we believe in these things to assess these kinds of claims. It would seem that if you are a deontologist and believe that that is the correct way to judge morality, you should use that framework when looking at these new questions. But often folks end up getting caught up in kind of their own biases or have a certain amount of skin in the game for some of these questions, and so answer the questions perhaps irrationally based on their intuition instead of based on the theory that they claim is what they use to dictate morality. So in this part of the series, we're going to attempt to apply these theories to those kinds of dilemmas, and cultural appropriation is the one that we're focusing on here. And in this video, we're looking at specifically what deontology's answer to the question of whether or not cultural appropriation is moral would be. We're going to look at several different versions of deontology to answer this question because there's different versions of the theory, as we covered in previous parts of this series. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, check out those parts of the series. Check out the couple videos we did on deontology, because that's going to be important for looking forward. So specifically, we looked into Kantian deontology. In this video, we're going to do two versions of Kantian deontology based on two different kind of statements of the categorical imperative. We looked at agent-centered deontology. We're also going to do two versions of that. We're going to look at intent-focused and action-focused agent-centered deontology. And finally, we're going to look at patient-centered deontology. So we're going to kind of look at those 5 different versions of deontology and see how each of them would judge particular things that are called cultural appropriation. If you need a refresher on any of those theories, please check out the earlier videos in the series. Now, cultural appropriation is poorly defined, as we discussed in the video right before this one. And so, before anyone gets in the comments and offers your own opinion, yes, I understand. There is not a solid or good definition for what cultural appropriation is, and there's a great deal of debate as to whether particular actions constitute cultural appropriation. And implicit in that debate is the assumption that cultural appropriation is wrong. We just need to figure out what counts as cultural appropriation. In these videos, we're not going to deal with that question of what counts as cultural appropriation or what doesn't, because I don't think that's the interesting question. I think that we have standards of ethics of what makes something right or wrong, and we should just take those individual actions and judge them against those standards. We're just using cultural appropriation as kind of a general title to lump together things that, for whatever reason, look similar and people claim are similar, but in reality may have different contexts on the ground and may end up with different answers. So, it seems to me the more interesting question is, do each of these actions on their own constitute something that is immoral or not? As opposed to saying, does this count as cultural appropriation? Because I don't think that's an interesting question. That's just, how do people refer to something? If you want more explanation of kind of the methodology we're trying to take with this video particularly, or some of the specific cases we're looking at, check out the previous video. In that video, we go over some of the methodology that we're using, as well as some kind of basic or very common arguments for and against these different examples. We have 7 specific examples. They're outlined in the previous video. In this video, we're just focusing on kind of assessing them based on the criteria of deontology as a rule. Also, just a quick note for any meta-ethical, realists or non-moral realists out there who say, well, this doesn't really matter because deontology, consequentialism, virtue ethics, they're all wrong. There's no such thing as a solid right and wrong of morality out there. This video can be taken either as just a logical exercise of saying what logically follows from if we were to hold that deontology is true, or if we were to hold that this position is true, what would logically follow from it in these specific instances, because I think that's an interesting logical exercise. Or you can take it as, well, sure, you don't believe that there's a solid right or wrong, but generally people have a set of principles that perhaps they use to guide them when they're making decisions without enough information, or when they're making decisions that don't have a clear you should do this or you should do that. They may use a particular normative ethical theory to make those decisions despite not believing wholeheartedly that this is good and this is bad. So you can view it as that as well, of saying, well, maybe you don't believe that deontology is correct and that there's some good or bad out there in the world, but you think that it's a useful way to help you decide what to do in a particular situation, because all of these will represent particular situations that one might find oneself in. All right, so with that out of the way, let's move to the examples. We're going to start with Halloween. Someone from a culture in power goes to a Halloween party dressed in a traditional outfit from another disempowered culture. The classic example is a white person goes to a Halloween party dressed as a Native American, often in a very skimpy Native American outfit. Is this action morally acceptable, or is it impermissible? Because most people are probably not going to say it's obligatory. So the question is it something that's acceptable, that you can do, and is not a bad action? Or is it a bad action? Is it a wrong action? If you are in a culture of power, and you dress in the traditional dress of someone from a culture out of power for Halloween, are you doing something that is wrong, according to deontology? So we're going to start with Cont in all of these. And we're going to look at two different versions of kind of the categorical imperative. We'll look at the categorical imperative that says action shouldn't be in some way self-defeating. And we'll look at the categorical imperative that says you shouldn't use others solely as a means to an end. All right? So first off, let's look at the idea of something being self-defeating. If we generalize this to everyone, would the action of going to Halloween parties in some way be self-defeated? So is this action something which would be self-defeating if everyone did it? So this is the classic, your mother says, if everyone jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? Would there be something self-defeating about it? For the first question, if we consider the point of Halloween to be having fun, so the purpose is to have fun, and if everyone came to a Halloween party in outfits making fun of another culture, the fun would probably be significantly reduced, as while some people would not take offense, others would. And so it might defeat, if the point of Halloween is just to have fun and not to engage in political debates or all of those kinds of things, just to have a time to relax and enjoy, then in some ways, if everyone came to a Halloween party doing something that was controversial, then, or doing something that was offending other people there, then that would be defeating the point of the Halloween party. And in some ways, it would turn it on its head. And so by that standard, this would be immoral, because that act defeats the goal of the party. Now, if you think that that wouldn't defeat the goal of the party, or you have a different goal of Halloween out there, you might disagree with this. Or you might just not hold this opinion. So note, with all of these pieces, there's going to be two different ways you can disagree with this. Either you can claim that my implication is correct, that if we believed that this is the correct morality, then this would follow. So you can say that that's correct. And the problem is just that, well, I don't really believe in that version of deontology. So that's the reason I disagree with this. Or you can disagree with me by saying that the implication is actually wrong, that the claims I'm making here, that if we made this claim, then this would follow, are incorrect. So try to make that distinction if you're disagreeing with any of these pieces in the comments between, is it the implication you're talking about of if we assume this, then it follows? Or is it the actual claim you're arguing about? Because I'm not arguing for any of these actual claims here. I'm arguing for the implication that if we held that claim, this would follow. All right? For the second question, it's difficult to see how the members of a culture out of power would be an end in themselves. So it seems more likely that they are being used solely as a means to an end of making a joke or wearing a sexy costume. It seems that, and this is going to kind of be the metric we're trying to judge this one on, there is not anything that the culture out of power that the person is dressing up as is benefiting in some way from the person in power dressing up as their culture. There's not something that Native Americans are getting as a benefit from someone choosing to dress up in the style of their culture for a Halloween party. They don't have a benefit. In fact, it seems that they have harms, they feel offended, they feel diminished, all of these kinds of things. And their culture is being compared to a range of other things. So, in the sense of using people solely as a means to an end, this would also seem to be classified as immoral. Now, you might say that it's not the people you're using, but the culture, and the culture doesn't have a certain amount of moral standing. If you brought that argument in, you might say, well, because cultures don't have moral standing and we're not really using the people, we're using a piece of their culture, then it's acceptable. That might be okay, but if that's what you're holding to, you're going to have some different consequences with the other pieces that we'll talk about. All right? But let's look through all of these. So what about agent-centered deontology? Here also we're going to look at two versions, intent-based and action-based theories. For intent-based theories, it's likely that this action will in fact be deemed moral, because we're assuming in this situation that the person is going dressed up in this costume because it's the only costume they could find, or because they thought it looked nice on them, because they want to look sexy, because they want to be funny, not because they are intending to do harm to another culture. Because they don't have that intent, the intent-based theory is probably going to give them a pass and say that this is permissible, as long as there's not that harmful intent. If someone purposefully dressed up in an outfit to make fun of a culture, then they would be morally responsible here. But as long as they didn't intend to cause that harm, for the intent-based theory, they're going to be fine. For action-based theories, on the other hand, there are three things we have to consider and that need to be present for the action-based theory. So, an immoral act. Something has to happen which we consider immoral. The will to act a certain way, and a causal connection. So, between that act and the immoral act that happened. So, this is a little bit looser than the intent. It's not that you intended to do something immoral, but rather that you intended to do something that had a causal connection with something immoral that happened. Here, whether or not something is moral will depend on what you think the immoral act is. Is someone seeing the outfit and being offended the immoral act? Or is it simply wearing the outfit? Is wearing the outfit the immoral act? Or is someone seeing it and being offended the act that's immoral? If you think it's the first, that someone seeing the outfit is what's immoral, that if you walked around your own house in the outfit and no one saw it, no one got offended by it, then no harm done, it's not immoral. But someone seeing it and then being offended by it, that's immoral. Then this might be permissible if the causal connection can't be made between the person being offended and you putting on the outfit. So if they, for example, would have been offended at something no matter what you did, then your action's probably not wrong. But if the only reason they became offended and upset and felt that their culture was diminished or all of these things was because you showed up in that outfit, there's a better case for a causal connection. But there's a lot of different theories in philosophy over what a causal connection really is. So there's a lot of debate there. If you think that it's the second, that just putting on the outfit is the immoral act, then there's a lot clearer of a causal connection between your choices and that happening. You probably just chose to put on the outfit. Unless someone forced you into it, you probably had a causal relationship to that. And so in that case, it would be immoral. And finally, let's look at patient-centered deontology. So patient-centered theories care about rights. They are built on claims such as you cannot use someone else's body, labor, or talent without their consent. The question here is whether or not someone else's culture should fit under the category of things that you can't use without consent. Can you use someone else's culture without consent? Does that count as their talent? I'm not sure. And this is going to be an issue that comes back over and over and over again with patient-centered theories. Is a culture something that you can use without someone else's consent? And even if we assume that it is, to kind of progress the theory further, who would be the one to give consent? If you find one person from that culture, is it acceptable? If you find a majority of people from that culture, is it acceptable? If you find everyone but one person from that culture, is it acceptable? All right? So one way to interpret it, because that was a lot of kind of high-level stuff, one way to interpret this for this specific example is that the act was immoral so long as individuals from that culture were present at the party and didn't consent to you wearing the outfit. So the act would be moral if everyone that was at the party said, it's okay, you can do this, and everyone that saw you. So just to be clear, the slide's a little wrong there. It would be moral if everyone consented to it. Everyone that was exposed to you and was seeing you do this consented to it. If they didn't consent to it, it would be immoral, which to a certain degree might align with some of our intuitions. It seems that a lot of people have the intuition that if you don't do any harm, the action's not really that immoral. So if everyone at the party is okay with that, or if it's a party where the specific context is you're making fun of all sorts of ideologies and all sorts of cultures, so everyone has kind of accepted this as the norm for that space, then it might be something that was acceptable or okay. But if people aren't all right with it, then maybe there's a problem. But like I said, there's going to be a really tough question that will come back over and over again of who gets to consent. If culture fits into the class of you can't use someone else's culture without their consent, then who in that culture gets to consent and make that choice? All right? It should not be surprising that such a controversial question would provide different answers from different theories, as our normal intuitions also provide different answers to the question of whether or not this is moral. So I don't want anyone that's watching this video to feel like we're punting on this, that we're just saying, well, it depends on a lot of things, not giving a clear answer. It depends on those things, but if you pick one side or the other, you will have a clear answer. And certain versions of this theory did give what seemed like pretty clear answers of yes, this is moral, or yes, this isn't. Where your intuition falls may help you better understand which of these deontological theories would work best for you, or reasons you might object to one of them. If you think it's moral, so long as harm was not intended, you might subscribe to an intent-based, agent-centered deontology. Whereas, if you think that what matters is whether everyone at the party was okay with it, you might be more aligned with a patient-centered deontological theory. So, this is more to help you match your intuitions to whichever theory best aligns with them. Because people often try to justify their intuitions in particular ways. Well, it was fine. Everyone at the party was fine with it, so it was okay. Or, well, I didn't mean to do anything wrong, so it was okay. Or, on the other side, there's a clear causal link between what you did and the harm that was done to people, so it was wrong. Or you are using people solely as a means to an end, so it is wrong. So whichever of those justifications you're using, you can see which theory fits better with that worldview. Right? Okay, I promise the rest of them are not going to take that long. That was kind of setting a bit of the stage for all these other examples, because we have a lot of examples to get through. So next up is fashion. Next example, someone from a culture in power wears an outfit associated with another culture, a culture out of power, simply because they like the style, or maybe they have a connection to that culture even though they're not from it. A month or two ago, there was an example of this where a white woman wore a traditionally Chinese dress to prom. not as a costume, just because she liked the style of the dress. The question here is it right for you, if you are in a position of being in a culture with power, is it right for you to wear an outfit from a culture which has less power than your own just because you like the style? And the important difference here is Halloween is often an event where the intent is around having fun or making fun of things or having pranks and these kinds of things, and dressing up as monsters. Whereas dressing in fashion in your daily life might have some overlap in that you're still trying to look good, but it also has a sense of utility, and it has a sense of not having that kind of ironic tone of trying to make fun of something. So let's see, based on these theories, is there a difference, or are they going to judge them the same? So once again, we'll start with Cont. The purpose of wearing clothes is to keep warm, have places to put things, look good, and to portray an identity. Would everyone wearing clothes from a culture with less power than theirs defeat these goals? The first three seem very unlikely, unless all of the cultures that have less power than your own don't have very warm clothes. You're probably fine. However, the last one may be a little more controversial. Does everyone wearing a piece of clothing because it looks good prevent someone else from wearing that same piece of clothing to portray their own identity? I'm not sure. Someone might say that everyone dressing this way makes it so when I dress this way, I can't portray my identity. I'm just dressing like everyone else is. If you think that that prevents them from portraying their identity, you'll find this immoral under this theory. If you think that it doesn't stop them from portraying their identity, that there are other ways they can portray their identity, that that's not the only thing that would be the sole piece that would allow them to portray their identity, you might find this action moral. I would lean towards moral on this one, but that might just be my own bias and how I would judge the situation. Depending on how you make that distinction, you may judge this different. In terms of means and ends, the important question is whether the culture is getting something out of you wearing the outfit. So using someone as solely a means to an end means that they're not getting anything out of the deal. And so if your deal is with the culture, because there's not an individual that you're taking from this, you might see that if the culture is getting something out of it, then this is moral. If they're not getting anything out of it, it's not. This might be why, in this specific situation, Chinese people in China had different opinions from Chinese people in America about this issue. According to interviews and news articles, many in China saw someone of a different race wearing their clothes as beneficial to their own culture because it popularized those styles, which meant that people back home making those things would make more money and be able to sell them in different ways, and their culture would spread more around the world and they could feel more at home in foreign places. However, some Chinese Americans claimed that this harmed their culture by diminishing traditional clothes. As above, this will depend only, in this case, it depends on whether you think this exchange is only benefiting the more powerful culture or benefiting both cultures. Is someone wearing clothes from a different culture benefiting both cultures? Now, you might take this a different way, and you might say, well, if I go out and I buy a piece of clothing from someone from that culture, then I'm not using them solely as a means to an end. I'm using them as an end in themselves. We're having an exchange. They're getting something, I'm getting something. I'm supporting that culture, and I'm getting something that I can wear that I think looks nice. So, depending on if you're talking about an individual versus the whole culture, this may be easier or harder to judge. If you're talking about the individual, it clearly seems fine. If you're talking about the relationship with the culture, it may be difficult, especially because cultures aren't homogeneous. They can exist differently in different places, as this example clearly illustrates. In terms of agent-centered theories, the intent-based theory, once again, will be fairly clear. So long as the person didn't intend to harm another culture by their actions, which assumed in this scenario is that they're not trying to harm the other culture, they're just wearing something that they feel is stylish, their actions are moral, and they're fine. For action-based theories, it might be a little more complicated. It'll once again depend on what you consider the immoral act. If the immoral act is something very general, like diminishing the connection between a particular outfit and the culture it was from, it's going to be really difficult to show a causal link between one person wearing an outfit and a general diminishing of the connection between that outfit and a culture. If you did it or if you didn't do it, you wouldn't move the needle that much. So showing that causal connection will be really difficult, which is going to push this towards being categorized as moral. If you think that the simple act of wearing the outfit was wrong, that it's completely regardless of context, that is wrong, the causal connection is going to be easier to justify, but I'm skeptical that you're going to be able to convince someone that the act in and of itself, devoid of context, is wrong. Because someone wearing that outfit in China, even if they're in a culture of power, might be right by everyone's standards, but someone doing it in America, that might be more concerning. So I think that second piece is going to be more difficult. And the first part of it, showing that causal connection between one individual making the choice to wear a particular outfit and a general diminishing of the connection between that outfit and that culture, I think that's going to be really hard to show. And so I'd say this would count it as moral. Finally, let's turn to patient-centered theories. Since these portray something as immoral if it's done without the consent, the central question here, as it was previously, will be who gets to consent for a culture. If I get one person from a culture to say that I can dress in a particular way, does that make it moral? If I can get 50% or more of a culture to consent, does that make it moral? If all but one person consents, is it moral then? It seems that getting a culture to consent is a really, really difficult thing, especially in this case, because the general consensus of people living in one area representing that culture said it was fine, and the general consensus of people living in another area representing that culture said it was not okay. So, by what standards should we be judged? One might say, to defend and try to offer a positive theory for the patient-centered theory, that it would depend on the people you were around. If you are a white woman living in China, and the majority of the folks from that culture around you that would see and be exposed to the garb that you're wearing are fine with you wearing that traditional garb, it's permissible, if that's the cultural context you exist in. However, if you're a white woman living in America, and the majority of people you'll see and interact with from that culture are not okay with it, then it's immoral. Either way, it's a difficult line to draw, but we may be able to contextualize it a bit of saying that it's the people that are exposed to this who get to decide. Now, in this case, the difficult piece was the internet exposes everyone to everything, and so you can't have those nice bundles of cultural context that could exist. And you could even say that maybe this woman in the specific area that she was living and the people that knew her were fine with it, but when exposed to the whole of America where people don't know her or don't know her relationship to the culture, they would be offended by it. So it's a difficult question. Once again, the question is who gets to consent for a culture, if we're going to say. On the other hand, we could just say for the patient-centered theory that cultures aren't something that you have rights over, that someone can use your culture without your permission, that it's just labor and talent and property, and culture isn't any of those things. If you go that direction with the patient-centered theory, most all of these are going to say it's moral. So, as with the Halloween costumes, there are a few clear answers here. However, unlike the Halloween costumes example, none of the theories derided this as outright immoral. All of them would either place it as moral or dependent on circumstances or your beliefs. Each of the theories listed here has a great deal of its own nuance, so it's important to understand that two people that are action-based, agent-centered deontologists may actually hold different beliefs on a particular action based on their theory of causation. This is why all of philosophy is so interconnected. Depending on your theory of causation, that may affect how you view an action and how you view the morality of a particular action. Because one person may say there are strong causal links between you making this choice and this bad thing happening, whereas another person may say, I hold the same ethics as you over there do, but I don't hold the same view about causality. I don't think there's a strong causal link, so I think it's moral. That's one of the reasons this is so context dependent, is it's dependent on all of the other philosophies that you may hold. All right, moving on, because we got to keep going. Mascots. This is what our image here is based on. This is the Redskins mascot, the Washington Redskins of the NFL. Next, we're going to look at sports mascots, particularly mascots from cultures out of power being used by cultures in power. This can range from the Washington Redskins mascot, which uses a derogatory slur in its name, to the Florida State Seminoles, which is actually supported by the local Seminole tribe. There are two questions here that we're going to ask, because clearly this video is going to last forever. If you are a team owner, is it moral for you to name your team after a culture with less power? And second, if you are a fan, because I assume most of my viewers don't own NFL teams, but maybe there's one or two out there, if you're a fan, is it moral to support a team which has such a mascot? Let's take a look. So once again, we start with Cont and the categorical imperative. For the owners, the purpose of creating a mascot is to build a brand and a sense of teamwork and community. If you have that sense of community, you're more likely to get more people to buy tickets, and you're more likely to have people identify with each other because of that relationship and that brand, so they're more likely to go and watch a game with friends, and you'll make money either on advertising or ticket sales. If everyone were to create mascots which were divisive, this sense of community and pride would definitely be harmed. As much as some of the political debates that people have are sometimes kept out of sports, though recent events might turn otherwise, the goal of those sports is to have people, give people something to unite around, to have that sense of teamwork. But if all of our mascots are divisive and people need to express their political opinions in addition to that, that does seem self-defeating for the owner that's putting that out there. Now, they may have other reasons that they want to keep a particular mascot around, but in terms of the categorical imperative question of if everyone did this, would this defeat the purpose of building teamwork and community? It seems like it will. This will mean that the morality of the owner's choice is going to be determined in part by how people see it. If it's seen as divisive, like the Redskins mascot, it is immoral. While if it is seen as a point of pride and community, like the Florida State Seminoles, it is moral. Since the former defeats the point of mascots, having divisive mascots defeats the point, while the latter does not. And there's going to be a certain amount of debate of what counts as something being divisive, but if it's sufficiently divisive such that if it were generalized, it would lead to the defeating of the idea of teamwork and community, that's going to be problematic. In terms of the choice of fans, it's going to depend on particular actions, which particular action is being considered. If everyone rooted for their home team, regardless of mascot, this would probably not destroy the purpose of sports in building community, no matter what the mascots were. However, if everyone actively supported divisive mascots, it would definitely harm fun and communities, because that would just be an extension of racism or those kinds of beliefs showcasing itself in a different context. Therefore, the immoral action for the fan is seeking out divisive mascots to support, because they are divisive, offensive, those kinds of things. While just supporting a team for other reasons, such as it's your hometown team or it's the team your family associates with, would be moral. Which seems to me to align with a lot of our intuitions. Most people would say it's wrong to purposefully root for teams that you think are racist, but it's okay to just root for a team that may have its own problems, but you have a different connection with it. We'll continue with Cont looking at the question of means and ends. As with the fashion question, for the owners, the question around means and ends will rest on whether or not the culture is getting something back from the use of its imagery. It seems to me it's going to be really hard to argue that the culture is receiving something positive from the perpetuation of derogatory terms and imagery, such as Redskins. And that doesn't give anything back to the culture. Other examples where the culture might take pride in that thing, there seems like there might be a two-way street there, and there's a good interchange that the culture is getting back, whether or not they admit it. In those cases, we might say those are moral. The ones that perpetuate derogatory stereotypes, probably not. For fans, it's unclear if their exchange is with the culture at all. It seems that their exchange is more with the owner, who they're not using solely as a means to an end. There's definitely an equal exchange going there. If anything, the owner's using them. One might object that we should not deal with people that may be using others solely as a means to an end, but that's not included in this theory, and that would lead to a lot of problems of, do I need to look up the moral history of my grocer before I go buy groceries there? I don't know. It seems that while we might say it's not perhaps the optimally beneficial or optimal path for one to take, it's really hard to say that it's immoral for you to deal with someone who engages in immoral behavior. Maybe you can make that case, but I think it's going to be a tough one, at least under this particular theory of not using others as solely a means to an end. Other theories, perhaps. In terms of intent-based, agent-centered theories, the individual's intent is what matters. While one might disagree with the owner that chooses to keep an iconic mascot if they're doing it just for profit or to energize fans and players, not because they are inherently racist or inherently trying to deride another culture, their action is moral. Similarly for fans, assuming they're not supporting a team just because of the derogatory term, once again, going back to a similar conclusion from the other theory, their actions would be moral under this theory. For action-based theories, it seems to me the owners may bear more responsibility. It's really hard to link a single person wearing an outfit to the continuation of particular stereotypes. Maybe you can, but I'm not sure you can show a causal link there between one person doing something and something as big as a stereotype. However, those who have the ability to change something as powerful and as iconic as a mascot, and thereby influence a larger narrative, bear a greater level of responsibility. And I think we can show a much stronger, at least, causal connection. Whether or not you think there's actually a causal connection there might be up for debate, but you can definitely show a stronger causal connection between someone that has the power over a mascot versus someone that's just wearing a hat. Since their actions might be seen as realistically causing part of the harm and causally connected to that, at least in the instance where we consider the team mascot harmful to people, their action will be immoral. For the same reason, any particular fan supporting a team is unlikely to be the cause of institutional oppression the way that someone who has the power to change a team name could. This means that unless there are clear causal lines that could be drawn for the fans, they're probably acting morally. And finally, let's look at patient-centered deontology. What will matter for this is consent. There are many teams which have gotten permission from the communities which they are named after to keep their name. The Florida State Seminoles is just one example of this, but there are a number of teams which were named after a group of Native Americans and have gone to that Native American community and have talked to them and have made it a source of pride and have gotten their consent to use that. This is probably the most clear, direct connection of having a culture be able to consent, especially with something as specific as one specific tribe in one specific area that's specifically related to one specific team mascot. All of the other questions of can a culture consent seem pretty amorphous and tough to distinguish. If there's anyone that's a solid case of it, this would be it. So the question of whether or not it's moral for patient-centered deontology, if the owner has consent of the group that they're named after, especially if it's a small group that you can theoretically get a sense of consent from, then it's moral. If they don't, it's not moral. Here, the fans may be just as guilty or innocent as the owners, since they are using something without permission is the same no matter how many hands it's passed through first. If permission was not given to use an image or a name originally, it's not morally acceptable for anyone to use it, if that's on the name of your business or if that's just on the jersey that you like to wear when you go work out. Because there's not that sense of consent along the way, unlike the just dealing with someone that's immoral, this one seems to transfer all the way down to fans. So, for patient-centered deontology, they may hold the fans culpable. Though they did so for different reasons, consent, benefits to culture, causal connection to harm, most of the theories did seem to separate out the extreme case of the Washington Redskins from the Florida State Seminoles, categorizing the former as immoral and the latter as moral, for the owners at least. Any team in between might depend on the exact circumstances, and some theories might categorize one way, and another theory might categorize it another way. But it seems to align with a lot of people's intuitions around these things. Also, in most of the cases, fans were usually, at the very least, less culpable than the owners, if not completely scot-free in taking moral actions, particularly because they had less power in these situations to change anything. The next subject is whitewashing in film. We're just knocking them down one after another. This is where characters which were portrayed originally, either in other media, if it's a fictional story, as individuals of color, or historic figures of color or of cultures that are in less power, are portrayed by white actors or are portrayed by actors in a culture with more power. The reason I'm using white and of color here is because it's called whitewashing, to explain that for anyone that doesn't understand the term. But generally, we're talking about situations where someone in a culture of power portrays someone out of power. Either they were out of power historically, or in the book that was written, they were of a different culture, and then they were whitewashed and portrayed by someone with more power in a movie. The question here is specifically for directors, writers, and producers. Is it moral to depict someone that was historically of a culture out of power as someone from a culture in power? What would Kant's categorical imperatives say of this practice? The point of movies, so the purpose, once again, is to tell stories, both those out of history as well as those from a writer's imagination. If everyone changed the race or culture of a character to a culture with more power, history and stories would still be told, though it might harm those who were incorrectly or insufficiently represented. It's hard to say that this practice would prevent us from telling stories. Therefore, by this metric, it seems moral. However, when looked at in terms of using people solely as a means to an end, this is going to run into problems. Changing someone's personal history, especially for a historical figure, in an attempt to make money, does not seem to benefit them in any way, while it does cause them harm. They're portrayed by someone that is not them, that doesn't identify with them. Similarly, changing an author's original character to look different seems to do them and their story harm, while not giving them something in return. Sure, you're producing a movie with them, but it would seem that if you didn't do that, they wouldn't receive any amount of harm. Their story wouldn't receive harm. So, I'd say, at least under that metric, this practice would count as immoral. In terms of intent-based agent-centered theories, what matters is what is in the heads of the directors and the producers. If they're making the choice to change the character's race because they want to only see people that look like the majority culture in film, that seems immoral under this theory, because their intent is to do something that we would consider wrong. Their intent is to purposefully be racist, to purposefully whitewash. If they're doing this because they want to, say, create a commentary on race, or because a bigger name actor would make more money, they might be acting ethically. And this is going to run into some issues when you have shows that are purposefully making fun of something, or making fun of a practice, perhaps making fun of the practice of whitewashing, or purposefully trying to go the other direction and trying to cast people in different races. So this is going to really depend on their intent, and it may have a greater degree of nuance when it comes to saying that, well, we don't think that someone casting Asian people as white in the movie 21, we think that that's problematic, but we don't think that Lin-Manuel Miranda portraying a bunch of people from the past in Hamilton as different races is problematic. Why? Maybe it's around intent. Maybe the question there is saying that the intent with Hamilton is to purposefully give people a voice and position that they haven't had before. And the purpose with something like 21 was just to make money or to purposefully portray specific people. It's going to depend on intent there. For action-based theories, as with team owners, there's a much clearer causal connection between the choice of producers and directors and what is viewed as acceptable in society. Maybe one movie doesn't do it, but there's a lot clearer connection between a director making that choice for something that thousands or millions of people will see and an individual making a choice for where 10 or 100 people will see. If the wrong action is misrepresenting history, then their movie may contribute very significantly to that misrepresentation, especially if that movie becomes the movie that people watch in their history classes to understand that piece of history. This theory would most likely claim that such an action is unethical, since it can be directly connected to an immoral act. Or it's much closer of a connection than of an individual doing something or engaging in those kinds of practices. And finally, when looking at this question relative to patient-centered theories, the key question will be consent. Sometimes a historical figure is alive, in which case the action is moral if they consent to having their race changed, while it wouldn't be moral if it's not, under this theory at least. For stories, this would amount to the author of the story consenting to the race of the character being changed. If the author consents, then it's moral. If the author doesn't consent, then it's not moral. Because, once again, there's just that choice of consent. If the person consents, it's fine. In these cases, it's clear-cut. If they consent, it's moral. If not, it's not. This becomes more difficult when you're dealing with historical figures or authors that are not alive. Who can consent for them? Their descendants? I'm not so sure. If so, which descendants? And should we instead maybe use what we know about their lives and beliefs to kind of formulate what we would expect they would choose? What if we want to cast people who were not in power to represent for roles, in roles written for or representing people with power? For example, would you be concerned by a multiracial Hamlet, even if you think Shakespeare would not have wanted it that way? Or would you be concerned with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson having... Do you think that they really would have consented to being played by African Americans in Hamilton? And should that matter? If someone is so long dead that perhaps their ideas are something we would consider outdated, does it matter if we're going with their intent? Once again, is culture or is these kinds of arts something we even care about? And do we care about it once someone is dead? In the patient-centered theory, does someone have rights after death? I think it's an interesting question. In this, we judge these theories taking the individual, either author or historical figure, as the target or patient. You might arrive at another set of conclusions if you took the culture instead as a whole and took that as the patient or the target of these actions. Similarly, if you took the choice as an individual's decision to buy a ticket for a movie or not, you'd probably end up with a lower level of moral responsibility. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in the comments. Whew, we gotta keep going. There's a lot more of these to get through. So, in the fifth scenario, we'll examine has to do with restaurants. Restaurants are often themed around particular types of food, particular ethnic groups, or groups of ethnic foods that are fusions together, various ethnic foods. All of those things are ways that you find restaurants. Oh, we're going to a Greek restaurant. Oh, we're going to a Korean restaurant. Oh, we're going to a, Middle Eastern, South African fusion restaurant. Sometimes the chefs and or owners of these restaurants are not of some or any of the ethnic groups from which the recipes are drawn, but rather an ethnic group with more power. Since most customers do not know who the chef or the owner of a particular restaurant is, we can't really look at the choice to eat at a certain restaurant. Or it seems we'd be putting undue burden on someone to say, you will be immoral if you go to this restaurant, even though maybe you can't find out who the owner is. So the question we're going to look at is particularly the choice of a head chef or the owner to start or cook at a restaurant which serves food from a culture which has less power than their own. Looking once again to Cont, the purpose of eating food is to enjoy something tasty, to gain sustenance, and maybe to share a culture. If all restaurants were run by someone from a different background than the food they cooked, or run from someone who had more power than the background of the people who originally made the food they cooked, it doesn't seem that any of these purposes would be defeated. if all the restaurants were run by someone who was not from that culture and made that food poorly, on the other hand, then the first and the third seem to be defeated. You wouldn't have tasty food, and you wouldn't actually be sharing the culture. Therefore, under this theory, what matters isn't that you are from a certain culture or not. It's that you make that food well or authentically. And it can be more problematic if you're not making that food authentically and you're from a separate culture. But if you're making the food authentically, then none of these elements of the purpose of eating that food are going to be defeated. In terms of using people solely as a means to an end, if someone runs a restaurant for the sole purpose of making money and does not make the food either authentically or well, we might see them as using the recipes or a culture solely as a means to an end, and therefore their action would seem immoral. But if they make food for the sake of the food itself and promoting that culture, the culture itself seems to gain a benefit. Namely, that food is more widespread and accessible. And it would seem that they are acting morally. Now, maybe you would say that the actual target of this is the other restaurant owners from that culture who would be put out of business by someone from a culture in power starting up another restaurant. But if we're taking culture as the target, the culture seems to benefit. If we're taking the other individuals as a target, I don't know if they have any more standing than someone else that wants to start up a restaurant of a completely different culture saying, well, you're doing something wrong because you're taking away my opportunity to start a restaurant. I'm not so sure that you can make that connection of them being the target, of your own competitors being a target of your actions. I'm not sure. Consequentialism is probably going to have a different answer than deontology would, but I would bet deontology wouldn't care as much about them, and they would say that culture is the specific target. In terms of intent-based theories, rarely does one cook food with the intention of making it poorly or inauthentically. So it seems really unlikely that this theory is going to categorize anyone that is trying to make good food as acting immorally. Now, if the harmful act which is done is considered to be, like we were discussing earlier, putting businesses run by people that are actually from that culture out of business, and the causal connection is that people from a culture in power are more likely to be able to sustain a business and put their competitors out of business, then this may be immoral. But note that this harm is harm done to individuals, not necessarily to a culture, since having multiple options for a type of food should in fact make the restaurants compete and give better versions of that food to everyone, and so benefit the culture in some way. So the question once again is it really a harm to have a good business and put other people out of business? I'm not sure. It seems to me, my intuition would say no. My intuition would say those people don't have standing, at least in deontology. In consequentialism, we get to consider all the possible consequences in the world, but in deontology, I don't think they have standing to object in this case. And finally, for patient-based theories, the concern, as always, rests on who is the party that is able to give consent. If someone from a culture in power trains under a professional chef from a culture out of power and that chef gives them permission to cook the type of food, it seems completely morally accessible. Though someone else might say that you should elicit consent from the other restaurant owners in your area. I think that's the wrong elicit. Since they are the ones you would actively harm if you were to put them out of business. Or maybe you should just elicit consent from someone in the community that is of that culture to say, does this food taste authentic? Is this something you would consider authentic? However, one might also set a low bar for consent, claiming that anyone that offers a recipe in a book or online is giving consent for you to use that recipe, no matter the origin. And if you set that bar for consent, most of these people are going to be doing something moral because they didn't take it without someone's permission. They bought a book. They had a real exchange. They're just now profiting off something they bought. And so in that case, it would be considered moral. Food is interestingly different than some of the other cases, since no one seems to object that anyone can consume food for other cultures, in the same way that it might be considered taboo to wear clothes from another culture. This means that the question must be on the creators of food. Most of these theories seem to point to the authenticity of food as the more important factor than the race or culture of the creator. Note that this is a separate question from the one of who should be able to create fusion dishes, because if you want to bring different flavors together and create something new, odds are you're probably not going to be from all the cultures you want to bring together to create a new dish of food. Though, since most of these theories making any culture's food seems to be moral, at least for deontology, so long as you do a good job, making fusion styles will not be a question, because it is moral to create food and to sell food and to start a restaurant from cultures that are outside your own. Oh, we're getting there. We're getting there. We're almost done, everybody. I know this is a really long video, but there were a lot of different topics here, and I didn't want to just kind of gloss over it because I do think there's a certain level of nuance in between each and every one of those. So, we're going to keep going. Next, we're going to look at a similar, though slightly different issue regarding music. Frequently, performers from a culture with more power will perform in a style created by a culture with less power. Due to their greater power and a larger portion of the audience perhaps resembling them, or a larger portion of the people that are willing to pay money for those things resembling them, they often receive more recognition and money for similar work. The question here is whether it is moral for these artists to produce work which uses styles that individuals from cultures of less power have created, when they may get more money and recognition for it than the person that originated that style from the culture with less power. There are a plethora of examples throughout the music industry. Check out the previous video for a couple of them. We're not going to go into them here. As before, we'll start with Cont. Music has a range of purposes, including telling stories, expressing emotions, exploring new rhythms and harmonies. If everyone created music from a different culture, or a culture with less power than their own, it seemed to enhance these purposes by creating new types of music and being able to tell different stories and express new emotions and use new rhythms and harmonies. The ability of cultures in power to have a wider audience does diminish the ability of music to tell all of the stories, but that's not caused by those artists choosing to branch out to other styles. It's caused by simply the fact that people in power have a bigger audience no matter what music they use. Yes, it is people who are out of power have diminished power to tell their stories through music, through whatever media you have. But an artist with more power choosing to go into a different genre is not going to cause that artist harm. If anything, for the culture, it's going to bring a larger audience to that type of music. And so, based on that, it would seem that this choice is moral. In terms of using others solely as a means to an end, it seems that promoting a style of music which originated and had roots in a particular culture will inevitably benefit that culture. Once again, taking the culture as the target, because it'll mean more people are exposed to that, more people are interested in that culture, and more people may listen to different kinds of music from that culture, which might be created by artists who were originally from that culture. They might hear stories from that culture that they might not have heard otherwise. However, if viewed not towards the culture, but towards a particular artist whose specific style was stolen, this might seem more problematic. Plagiarism of an artist is going to be moral. But the use of a more general style is not under this view, because the plagiarism is taking from a specific artist without them benefiting, because the artist doesn't necessarily benefit from you stealing their style. However, you using a general style that many artists use is going to benefit that genre or that style. And so in that way, because what you're taking from is the genre, not the individual, you're benefiting the genre, and so you're not using it solely as a means to an end. If you're taking solely from an individual and plagiarizing from them, you're harming an individual, because that exposure isn't going to help them in the same way it would help a genre. It would crowd out, to use economics terms, it might crowd out their viewers, whereas just doing things related to a general genre would crowd in more listeners. I suppose you don't view music. Well, these days you do. Where the line is drawn around what exactly constitutes plagiarism is a very difficult piece to draw. But it might be drawn around whether or not something crowds in or crowds out. Does it bring more listeners to the thing that you took it from, or does it bring their listeners over to you? If it crowds people in and is beneficial, this is moral. If it crowds people out and steals from that artist, it's not. Intent-based agent-centered deontological theories are unlikely to claim that someone is acting immorally in these situations. Unless an artist is actively trying to diminish the voices of artists from other cultures, their goal is likely just to make good music or make money. And so, as long as their intent isn't to quash other people's voices, they're moral. Agent-based action-centered deontological theories, on the other hand, will call it moral from the perspective of the culture, and that the act of promoting music from another culture just adds to the people that listen to that type of music, and therefore is beneficial for that culture and that genre of music. Though it's possible, but once again, we need some empirical evidence to verify, that in fact these artists from cultures with power are actually crowding in listeners and benefiting them, the genre, rather than crowding them out. Just to be clear on that difference, if you don't know these kind of economics terms, crowding in means that I exposed a bunch more people to this particular genre, so now they're listening to all of those types of music, all of those artists within that genre. Crowding out means that I moved into this genre. Instead of bringing my own listeners with me, I stole listeners from the other people and didn't bring anyone else in. So I'm taking the other listeners that are going on. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I might be stretching those terms a little bit. But in terms of patient-centered deontology, we need someone to consent. If you use a particular style of a particular musician and they consent, the act seems moral. If you use general tools from a genre, it seems a lot harder to get consent, and less clear who you would need consent from, since many of these techniques have no clear creator. Outside of plagiarism, I'm unsure where one can say that something like a metaphor, a particular chord progression, or an internal rhyme scheme requires consent, or can be owned by anyone in the same way that one's own body and labor can be. This means that if you're directly sampling from someone, you might want to get their permission, but if you're simply using a style you've seen used, that's completely ethical, and what artists and musicians do all the time. While it is definitely unfair that artists of certain cultural backgrounds can play very similar music, but not get the same reception as those from other cultural backgrounds, most of these theories of deontology do not claim the act of using a musical style of a less privileged group is immoral. Though more research could certainly be done to see if artists with power crowd in listeners to a genre, or crowd out and steal listeners from artists with less power. I would guess it would be the first one, but I have no empirical research to back that claim up. And I'm skeptical, so I don't know either way. We're finally to the end. The final topic we'll cover is writing. Often writers choose to tell stories from viewpoints that are not their own. This can exist across many dimensions of diversity. It is very rare for an author to write a book where the only people in that book look, sound, feel exactly the way that they do. That would be a pretty boring book. Here, we're going to focus specifically on those authors that choose to write from the perspective of a different culture. Specifically, we're asking, is it moral to write from a character with a different cultural perspective than your own? Once more, with Cont. The purpose of writing is to tell stories, to recount history, to record perspectives and experiences. If everyone wrote a range of characters of different backgrounds, it seems that we would have more perspectives and stories, not less. In fact, one might argue that writing only characters of your own perspective is itself immoral, as if everyone did that, we'd have really bad stories and very limited records of experiences, because no one only interacts with people from a culture perfectly identical to them, and even if they do, they seem to lead not as interesting a life as someone that interacts with a range of different cultures. It seems like this will be the most analogous to cooking in this respect. The problem there was not that people might cook food from other cultures, but rather that they would do it poorly and poorly represent that culture. The problem is not when people attempt to write from other perspectives. It arises when they do so poorly. If you write a character of a different culture as one-dimensional or misrepresent their experience, that is problematic, since if everyone did that, it would fail to accurately record perspectives and experiences, not to mention reinforce many, many harmful stereotypes. In terms of means and ends, it will also depend on the type of character you write. If the only point of a particular character is to perpetuate a negative stereotype or misrepresent an experience, that might constitute using a culture only as a means to an end. However, if that character has depth and nuance, even if they do fit into some stereotypes, they do justice to the lived experience, and then that is what matters far more than who is writing the character. The question is the quality of the characters and their ability to represent actual experiences that would make it moral or immoral. If characters are poorly written and don't represent actual experiences but rather represent negative stereotypes, that is using those people, those cultural experiences solely as a means to an end of telling your own story. But if you're telling their story as well, if you're expressing their perspectives, then at least under this theory, it's going to be allowed to be moral. When it comes to intent-based theories of agent-centered deontology, there are some people perhaps that actively attempt to misrepresent a particular culture to further a particular bias or stereotype. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if these exist in a lot of places. These people, under the intent-based theory, are morally wrong. However, if your goal, your attempt is to create an authentic or deep character, even if you fail, perhaps just because you're a bad writer, this theory will count your action as moral. The action-based theory, on the other hand, requires some causal connection between your act and the harm done. For this theory, a poor portrayal would be wrong if you caused some harm to someone. If you never sold a book, you'd probably escape culpability. However, if you portrayed a character from another culture with sufficient depth, you would be acting ethically, regardless of your own cultural background and regardless of how many books you sold. But if you sold a lot of books and portrayed characters inaccurately or stereotypically from a different culture in such a way that it actively perpetuated those stereotypes that harmed those people, I think you'd be in trouble. I think there can be a causal connection there because books, like movies or football teams, are so widespread. Finally, in terms of patient-centered deontology, while it might be good to obtain someone's permission before using their exact story, types of stories or characters do not feel like the kinds of things that someone can own or that someone needs to give permission to use in the same way that the labor or a body might be. And even if there was this requirement, it's completely unclear who you would need to get the permission from. If you are telling a story unique to an individual or a small group of people, their permission could be a moral prerequisite. But telling a story with characters that come from different cultures than you do only requires permission in that someone can validate that those characters are accurately representing that lived experience. Not that you are getting the agreement of everyone in that culture to say that this is a perfect portrayal. Hopefully that's clear. It seems to me that characters, at least, don't require the same level of consent that many other things would in patient-centered deontology. Now, if you're portraying a historical figure, if you're writing in the sense of actually writing something that's history, there would be a much higher bar for consent that you would have to meet because you might be misrepresenting things that actually happened to that person. And even if they were in the history in the past, in the same way with movies, it's going to be tough to get that consent. Though that doesn't mean it's not a story that should be told. It just means that it's going to be a bit more of an ethical minefield. As with music, it is an injustice that it is hard for individuals of particular backgrounds to get their stories published, even when people of other backgrounds can get similar stories published and become widespread. But what that does not mean is that people should be restricted to writing about their own experience. Such a rule would greatly limit the range of stories we could tell and would likely do little to resolve this injustice. If anything, it would exacerbate it and make it worse. So, with that, most of the theories that we've covered are going to say, perhaps under certain constraints around intent and around accuracy, that writing in the voice of a character from a different culture is morally acceptable. Whew. I've done my best to argue for how each of these philosophical positions would tackle each of these ethical dilemmas. That was a lot of different positions. We did 7 different examples and 5 different positions for each one. That was 35 different positions we just defended. As I said before, in your comments, please make a distinction between if you disagree with how I interpreted the way in which a particular theory addressed a specific situation, and if you disagree with a particular theory because of how it handles a specific situation. I'm not defending these theories. I think there's problems with all of them. I'm a skeptic deep down. But you might say that you agree with Carneades' interpretation of the implication, but because of that implication, that has led you to, through a nice modus tollens, disagree with the theory itself. That's a valid thing. You can also say that you disagree with my interpretation of how these theories would handle these particular situations, either because you still agree with that theory or because you disagree with that theory and you don't think it would handle this in the right way. Either way, distinguish between those two situations in your comments, because I'm curious to see how well you think I tackled these particular positions, and if you hold any of these positions, how you would have interpreted themselves. To simply answer the question, is cultural appropriation immoral, is impossible, since even in these more specific instances, the morality will depend on so many other factors. Hopefully, this will give you a framework, though, to assess new instances of similar moral dilemmas and discern which actions are moral according to which theories and which actions are immoral. If we've done nothing else, hopefully this has given you a plethora of examples of how each of these 5 different deontological theories would handle a range of different situations and some of the yardsticks that they would use to test them on morality. All right, this video has gone on way too long, all in one take. What did you think? Do you agree with how I said that they would treat positions? Would treat each situation? Did any of these treatments make you more or less interested or aligned with a particular position? This is a touchy subject, and we're doing this at the last minute of the video, so I'm sure a bunch of people who are already writing in the comments haven't seen it. But please try to stick to philosophical arguments and avoid ad hominem insults in the comments. As we've seen throughout this video, this is something that even very similar ethical theories will tackle in slightly different ways because there's so much diversity in the actual experiences and the actual questions that are being asked here. Because of that, please understand that nuance, accept that nuance, bring that nuance into your discussions below, stick to philosophical arguments, try to leave the ad hominems to the side. The ad hominem troll would be a lovely image to make one day. Whew! All right, I'm getting tired. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. In the next video, we're going to be covering how consequentialism deals with this. Maybe we'll find a way to make it a shorter video. Maybe it'll be longer. Who knows? Stay skeptical, everybody.